It was an ordinary afternoon in a bustling suburban neighborhood. Kids rode their bikes down the street, neighbors exchanged friendly waves, and the distant hum of a lawnmower filled the air. In the middle of this peaceful scene, 13-year-old Jamal was walking home from basketball practice, his worn sneakers scuffing against the sidewalk as he clutched his favorite ball under his arm. He was just a kid, a bright-eyed boy with dreams of making it big one day, maybe as an NBA star. But for now, all he cared about was getting home and sharing his latest moves with his dad, a man who had always been his biggest supporter. Jamal didn't know that his walk home would soon turn into something out of a nightmare. A patrol car creaked down the street behind him. Inside were two officers scanning the area, responding to a vague call about a suspicious individual in the area. The description, vague enough to fit half the neighborhood, but somehow narrowed down to Jamal. The car pulled over, the siren chirping twice. Jamal froze as the officers stepped out, their expressions tense. "Hey, kid," one of them called, his tone sharp and demanding. "Come over here for a second." Jamal hesitated, clutching his basketball tighter. His mind raced. Had he done something wrong? He was just walking home. His dad always told him to be polite and respectful in situations like this, but he could feel his heart pounding in his chest. "Am I in trouble?" he asked, his voice trembling. The officers exchanged a glance. One reached for his radio, while the other gestured for Jamal to move closer. "Let's just talk," the officer said, though his tone was anything but reassuring. Before Jamal knew it, the situation escalated. The officers claimed he matched the description of a suspect they were looking for. They ignored his protests, his insistence that he had just come from the park and hadn't done anything wrong. They didn't care about his basketball, his backpack, or the look of fear in his young eyes. People began to gather, murmurs of concern rippling through the small crowd. A neighbor called out, "That's Jamal. He's a good kid. What are you doing?" But the officers didn't listen. They handcuffed him, the cold metal biting into his wrists. Tears welled up in Jamal's eyes as he was shoved into the back of the patrol car. His mind screamed for his dad, for someone, anyone, to come and help. But then, as the patrol car pulled into the station and the officers led Jamal inside, something shifted. The officers' confidence began to waver. They glanced at each other nervously, suddenly unsure. A booming voice echoed through the station, one filled with authority and unmistakable power. "What's going on here?" Every head in the room turned. Jamal looked up, his heart skipping a beat. Standing in the doorway was a man whose presence commanded immediate respect. It was Jamal's father, but this wasn't the dad who helped him practice free throws or cooked pancakes on Sunday mornings. This was a man they clearly hadn't expected, a man who was about to turn their entire world upside down. The next part of the story dives into the unfolding drama, where secrets are revealed and the officers learn a lesson they'll never forget. The room seemed to shrink under the weight of Jamal's father's presence. His voice, firm and commanding, cut through the noise like a knife. He stepped forward with purpose, his sharp suit and polished demeanor in stark contrast to the chaotic scene unfolding around him. This was a man who had walked into countless high-pressure situations before and come out unshaken. But tonight, it wasn't about business or politics. It was about his son, his boy. The officers froze for a moment, their earlier bravado fading as they exchanged uneasy glances. The younger one cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the moment. "Sir, this is a private matter. Please step aside while we handle the situation," he said, his voice faltering just slightly. But Jamal's father didn't budge. His dark eyes scanned the room, locking onto his son, who sat on a hard bench in the corner, hands cuffed and head hung low. "Jamal," he said softly, his tone shifting to one of reassurance. "Are you okay, son?" Jamal looked up, tears still streaming down his cheeks. He nodded faintly, though his eyes betrayed the fear and confusion he felt. The elder man turned his attention back to the officers, his expression hardening. "You handcuffed a child," he said, his voice dripping with disbelief. You dragged my son in here like a criminal without so much as notifying me. I want to know why." The older officer, clearly the one in charge, took a hesitant step forward. "Look, sir, we're just following up on a report. Your son matched the description of someone we were looking for." Jamal's father raised an eyebrow, his tone sharp. "A report? What kind of report justifies treating an innocent boy like this? Did you ask him any questions? Did you even consider that you might have the wrong person?" The room was silent except for the distant hum of the station's fluorescent lights. The officers seemed to struggle for words, their earlier confidence evaporating under the weight of his scrutiny. Meanwhile, Jamal sat quietly, his mind racing. He knew his dad was someone important. People in their neighborhood often stopped to talk to him, shaking his hand with respect. But seeing him like this, commanding the room with such authority, was something else entirely. For the first time that night, a flicker of hope sparked within him. One of the officers finally spoke up, his voice defensive. "We were acting on a credible tip. A witness said the suspect was carrying something, maybe stolen property. Your son was walking down the street with a backpack and looked." He paused, fumbling for the right word. "Looked what?" Jamal's father interrupted, his voice dangerously calm. "Say it. What exactly about my son made him suspicious to you?" The officer's hesitation spoke volumes. He looked at his partner for support, but none came. The elder man didn't wait for an answer. "You made an assumption based on nothing more than your own biases, didn't you?" His voice rose slightly, each word hitting like a hammer. "You saw a young black boy walking alone, and that was enough for you to decide he was guilty." The weight of his words hung in the air. The officers shifted uncomfortably, avoiding his piercing gaze. At that moment, a door in the back of the station opened, and a woman stepped out, a lieutenant. By the look of her crisp uniform and confident stride, she took one look at the scene before her and frowned. "What's going on here?" she asked, her tone brisk. The older officer turned to her, relief washing over his face. "Lieutenant, we were just handling a situation. This gentleman here is—" "I know who he is." The lieutenant cut him off, her eyes narrowing. "Mr. Carter, isn't it?" She extended a hand toward Jamal's father, who shook it firmly. "Lieutenant," he said, his voice regaining its calm edge, "I'd like to know why my son was arrested and treated like this without any proper cause." The lieutenant glanced at Jamal, her expression softening slightly before turning back to the officers. "Is this the suspect from the report?" The younger officer nodded, but his confidence was gone. "Yes, ma'am. He fit the description." "And what description is that?" she interrupted, her voice sharp. "Did you verify it? Did you find anything to substantiate your claim?" The room grew quieter still. The officers fumbled through their explanations, their words increasingly disjointed. Jamal's father crossed his arms, watching them closely. "You didn't, did you? You have nothing. No evidence, no stolen property, just a scared child you decided to blame because it was convenient." The lieutenant's jaw tightened. She turned to Jamal, her voice gentler now. "Son, do you have anything in your bag that doesn't belong to you?" Jamal shook his head vigorously. "No, ma'am, just my basketball stuff." "Open it," she said, motioning toward one of the officers. Reluctantly, the younger officer stepped forward and unzipped Jamal's backpack. He pulled out a pair of sneakers, a water bottle, and a crumpled jersey, nothing more. The silence that followed was deafening. The lieutenant turned back to the officers, her expression stern. "Uncuff him. Now." As the metal restraints were removed from Jamal's wrists, his father stepped forward, placing a protective hand on his shoulder. "It's okay, son," he said softly. "You're coming home with me." But even as Jamal stood up, his heart pounding with a mix of relief and lingering fear, the tension in the room didn't ease. His father wasn't done. "This isn't over," he said, his voice firm. "I want a full explanation, and I want accountability. This isn't just about Jamal. It's about every child you've treated this way, every family you've put through this kind of fear and pain. You think you can act without consequences, but I promise you that ends now." The lieutenant nodded sullenly. "Mr. Carter, I understand your frustration, and I assure you, we'll conduct a full review of this incident." But Mr. Carter didn't seem entirely convinced. He gave the officers one last piercing look before guiding Jamal toward the door. As they walked out into the cool night air, Jamal glanced up at his dad, his voice barely above a whisper. "Dad, who are you?" His father paused, his expression softening. "I'm your father," he said simply. "And I'm someone who's not going to let this happen to you, or anyone else, ever again." But even as they walked away from the station, the weight of what had just happened lingered. Questions remained unanswered. Tension simmered beneath the surface, and while Jamal was free, it was clear that this was just the beginning of a much bigger fight. The car ride home was silent, except for the low hum of the engine. Jamal stared out the window, his thoughts racing as streetlights flickered past. His dad's jaw was tight, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. Jamal wanted to say something, but the words wouldn't come. How could he explain the fear he felt, the way the officers had looked at him like he was nothing more than a problem to be dealt with? Finally, his father broke the silence. "Jamal, I need you to tell me everything that happened, from the beginning." Jamal hesitated, glancing at his dad's face. It wasn't angry, but there was a seriousness there that made him nervous. "I was just walking home," he said quietly, "from the park. I wasn't doing anything wrong. They pulled up and started asking me questions. They said I matched a description, but I didn't understand. I tried to tell them I didn't do anything, but..." His voice trailed off as he looked down at his hands. "They didn't listen," his dad finished for him, his voice heavy with frustration. "Of course, they didn't." Jamal nodded. "They put the cuffs on me so fast. I didn't even know what was happening. I was so scared, Dad." His father let out a slow breath, his grip on the wheel loosening slightly. "I know, son, and I'm sorry you had to go through that. But this is exactly why I've always told you to be careful. It's not right, but it's the reality we live in." Jamal swallowed hard, his mind flashing back to the way the officers had stared him down, their voices cold and accusatory. "But I didn't do anything wrong," he said, his voice trembling. "Why do they think I did?" His dad glanced at him briefly before turning his eyes back to the road. "Because, Jamal, some people see the color of your skin before they see you. And sometimes that's all they need to decide you're guilty." Jamal's chest tightened at his dad's words. It wasn't the first time he heard something like this, but it was the first time it had hit so close to home. He thought about the neighbors who had shouted in his defense, about the officers' nervous glances when his dad had walked into the station. For the first time, he realized just how complicated and unfair the world could be. When they got home, Jamal's mom was waiting for them, her face lined with worry. She rushed to her son, pulling him into a tight hug. "Are you okay, baby?" she asked, her voice cracking. Jamal nodded against her shoulder, the tension in his body finally starting to ease. "I'm okay, Mom." She pulled back to look at him, her hands on his shoulders. "What happened? Why didn't they call us?" Mr. Carter stepped in, his tone calm but firm. "They didn't call because they knew they messed up. They're trying to cover themselves, but we're not letting this slide." Jamal's mom looked at her husband, her eyes narrowing. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to make sure this doesn't happen again," he said. "Not to Jamal, not to anyone." Over the next few days, the story started to spread. Neighbors who had witnessed the arrest began sharing what they saw, and word of the incident reached local community leaders. Mr. Carter, true to his word, didn't let it rest. He started making calls, connecting with lawyers, activists, and journalists who were interested in shedding light on what had happened. Meanwhile, Jamal tried to settle back into his routine, but things didn't feel the same. At school, some of his classmates whispered about the incident, their curiosity laced with judgment. Others offered words of support, but Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, scrutinized in a way he never had been before. One afternoon, as Jamal sat in his room staring at his basketball, his best friend Malik showed up. Malik was one of the few people who hadn't asked a million questions or treated Jamal any differently since the incident. "Hey," Malik said, plopping down on the bed beside him. "You want to shoot some hoops?" Jamal shrugged. "I don't know. I'm not really in the mood." The weight of Jefferson's words hung in the air. Jamal's dad looked at him, a mix of anger and determination in his eyes. "Thank you for telling us," he said. "We'll look into it." Later that evening, Mr. Carter sat in his study, poring over notes and documents. Jamal peeked in, unsure if he should interrupt. His dad noticed him and gestured for him to come in. "What's up, son?" he asked, his tone softer than it had been in days. Jamal hesitated before sitting down across from him. Do you think they'll listen? The police, the neighbors, everyone. Do you think they'll actually change?" His dad leaned back, his face thoughtful. "Change doesn't come easy, Jamal. It takes time, effort, and a lot of people willing to stand up and fight. But I believe it's possible, and even if it's hard, it's worth it." Jamal nodded slowly, his dad's words sinking in. But the uncertainty lingered, the questions still unanswered. Who had made that call? Why had they targeted him? And most importantly, would the truth ever come out? As the fight for justice continued, the tension in the neighborhood grew. Lines were being drawn, alliances formed, and secrets began to surface. And as Jamal and his family braced for what was coming, they couldn't shake the feeling that the real battle was just beginning. The days grew heavier as the fight for justice took on a life of its own. Jamal's dad was working harder than ever, speaking at meetings, coordinating with activists, and demanding transparency from the police department. The community rallied behind the Carters, their support creating a wave of momentum that couldn't be ignored. But as the pressure mounted, so did the backlash. One evening, as the family sat down for dinner, a sharp knock echoed through the house. Mr. Carter went to answer it, finding a woman standing on the porch. She looked nervous, her hands fidgeting with the strap of her purse. "Mr. Carter," she asked hesitantly. "That's me," he replied. "Can I help you?" She glanced over her shoulder before speaking again, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need to talk to you. It's about the night your son was arrested." He frowned but opened the door wider. "Come in." The woman introduced herself as Erica, a dispatcher at the police station. Her eyes darted around the room as she sat on the edge of the couch. "I shouldn't be here," she admitted. "If they find out I came to you." "They won't," Mr. Carter assured her. "What do you need to tell us?" Erica took a deep breath, her words tumbling out in a rush. "I heard the call that night, the one that led to your son's arrest, and I heard what happened after. The officers, they weren't following protocol. They knew the description didn't match Jamal, but they went after him anyway." Jamal, who had been listening from the dining table, felt a chill run down his spine. "Why?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Erica looked at him, her expression heavy with regret. "I think they were trying to make a quick arrest. The pressure to solve cases, even minor ones, is high. But what they did wasn't right." Mr. Carter leaned forward, his jaw tight. "Do you have proof of this?" She nodded hesitantly. "I managed to get a copy of the call log and the officer's reports, but I have to be careful. If anyone finds out I leaked this, I could lose my job, or worse." Jamal's mom, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. "Why are you risking this? Why come forward?" Erica's eyes filled with tears. "Because it's wrong. What happened to your son? What happens to so many others? It's not how things should be, and I couldn't stay silent anymore." Mr. Carter thanked her, promising to protect her identity as much as possible. After she left, the family sat in stunned silence. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, but with each revelation, the picture grew more unsettling. The following morning, Mr. Carter shared the new evidence with the lawyer he had been working with. Together, they decided to present it at the next community meeting, a gathering that had gained significant attention in recent weeks. But before they could finalize their plan, another bombshell dropped. Jamal was walking home from school when he noticed a police car parked on the corner. At first, he tried to ignore it, but as he got closer, the officer inside rolled down the window. "Jamal Carter," he called. Jamal froze. "Yeah. We need to have a word with your dad." The officer's tone wasn't hostile, but Jamal couldn't help the knot of fear that formed in his stomach. He nodded and hurried home, the police car following at a slow pace. When he walked through the door, his dad was already waiting, having seen the car pull up. "What's this about?" Mr. Carter asked as the officer stepped inside. The officer hesitated before speaking. "There's been an incident. One of the neighbors reported vandalism, and your family's name came up." Jamal's mom stepped forward, her voice sharp. "Are you accusing us of something?" The officer raised his hands defensively. "No accusations, we're just following up. But I thought you should know. It seems someone's trying to stir up trouble." Mr. Carter's eyes narrowed. "You think this is related to what happened with Jamal?" The officer didn't answer directly, but his silence spoke volumes. After he left, the family sat down to discuss what had happened. It was clear that someone in the neighborhood was trying to discredit them, to paint them as troublemakers and shift the narrative. But who and why? As Jamal sat in his room that night, he couldn't shake the feeling that things were spiraling out of control. He thought about the officer's words, the neighbor's whispers, and Erica's revelations. Somewhere in all of this chaos, the truth was buried. But uncovering it would mean taking risks, challenging the status quo in a way that could have serious consequences. And as the tension reached a boiling point, Jamal couldn't help but wonder, how far would they have to go to make things right? The air in the community meeting hall was thick with tension. Rows of neighbors filled the seats, their faces a mix of curiosity, concern, and quiet skepticism. At the front, Mr. Carter stood beside the lawyer, holding a folder filled with evidence. Jamal sat a few rows back with his mom, his heart pounding as he scanned the crowd. He recognized faces, teachers, classmates' parents, even Mr. Jefferson. But there were others he didn't know, their expressions unreadable. He couldn't shake the feeling that something big was about to happen. When Mr. Carter stepped up to the microphone, the room fell silent. He took a deep breath, his voice steady but firm as he recounted the events of that night. He didn't just talk about Jamal's arrest, he painted a broader picture, one of systemic bias and misplaced suspicion. He spoke about the anonymous call, the officer's hasty actions, and the mounting evidence that suggested the incident was not an isolated case. "And tonight," he said, holding up the folder, "we have proof. Proof that the system failed my son, and that it's failing this community." The lawyer took over, presenting Erica's findings to the crowd. Copies of the call log and police reports were handed out, the damning details sparking murmurs throughout the room. Some nodded in agreement, their faces set with determination. Others shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact. Jamal watched it all, his chest tight with a mix of pride and fear. Just as the lawyer finished her presentation, a voice rang out from the back of the room. "I think we've heard enough." All heads turned as a man stepped forward. Jamal recognized him immediately, Mr. Bennett, a neighbor who lived a few streets over. He was known for his gruff demeanor and sharp opinions, but Jamal had never paid him much attention. Now, Bennett's face was flushed, his eyes darting nervously as he cleared his throat. "I made the call," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "That night, I called the police." The room erupted in gasps and whispers. Jamal froze, his heart racing as Bennett continued. "I saw someone walking through the neighborhood," he explained, his words tumbling out in a rush. "It was dark, and I thought he looked suspicious. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I just wanted to keep the neighborhood safe." Mr. Carter's voice cut through the noise, calm but unyielding. "You didn't think to speak to him? To ask him if he lived here, if he needed help?" Bennett shook his head, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I didn't think. I just reacted." The weight of his confession hung in the air, the room eerily quiet. Jamal felt a surge of anger and sadness, his mind racing with questions. How could someone who lived so close, who had probably seen him dozens of times, think he didn't belong? Before anyone could respond, another voice spoke up, Erica. She had slipped into the back of the room unnoticed, her presence a quiet but powerful statement. "This isn't just about one call," she said, her tone firm. "It's about a system that allows these calls to turn into arrests, about officers who act on assumptions instead of facts. We have to do better." The meeting ended with a mix of emotions: anger, guilt, hope. Bennett apologized to Jamal and his family, his voice trembling as he admitted he had been wrong. It wasn't enough to erase what had happened, but it was a start. In the days that followed, the community began to change. Conversations about bias and accountability took center stage, and the police department. But the biggest change came within Jamal himself. What had started as a terrifying ordeal became a turning point, not just for him, but for his family and his neighborhood. He realized that standing up for what's right wasn't easy, but it was necessary. And as he walked through the neighborhood now, he felt something he hadn't in a long time. A sense of belonging, not just to a place, but to a movement that was bigger than himself. Yet, as life began to settle back into a new normal, a final twist came. One afternoon, as Jamal and his dad were sorting through papers, they found an anonymous letter slipped under their door. The message was simple, written in shaky handwriting. "I'm sorry for what happened. I wasn't brave enough to stand up then, but I'll stand with you now." It wasn't signed, and they didn't know who had sent it, but it didn't matter. It was proof that even in the face of fear and division, change was possible, and that was enough. The days following the meeting were quieter, almost eerily so. The kind of quiet that comes after a storm, when the world is catching its breath. Jamal found himself reflecting on everything that had happened, the weight of it all settling in as a mix of exhaustion and relief. Life in the neighborhood had taken on a different rhythm. People waved more often, stopped to chat instead of walking past with hurried glances. It was subtle, but it felt like a start. Jamal's dad, however, wasn't done. The fight for accountability didn't end with one meeting or one apology. He worked tirelessly with community leaders and local officials to ensure real change was put into action. The police department issued a formal statement acknowledging their mistakes, pledging to revise their policies and focus on community-based approaches. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. One afternoon, as Jamal sat on the porch tossing a basketball between his hands, Mr. Jefferson stopped by. The old man's cane tapped rhythmically against the pavement as he made his way up the steps. "How's it going, kid?" he asked, his tone warm but curious. Jamal shrugged. "Better, I guess. Things feel different now." Jefferson nodded, lowering himself onto the porch chair. "That's the thing about change. It's slow, and sometimes it doesn't feel like much. But it's there if you look close enough." Jamal smiled, appreciating the wisdom in his words. "Thanks, Mr. Jefferson, for everything." The older man chuckled. "I didn't do much. That was all you and your family. You've got more courage than most people I know." As Jefferson left, Jamal felt a renewed sense of pride. He thought back to the night of his arrest, to the fear and humiliation that had consumed him. It was hard to believe how far they had come since then. He hadn't just survived the ordeal, he had grown from it, learned from it. Later that evening, Jamal's dad called the family together. They sat in the living room, the atmosphere lighter than it had been in months. "I've got some good news," Mr. Carter began, a rare smile breaking across his face. "The departments agreed to create a civilian oversight board. They'll review complaints, look at policies, and make sure something like this doesn't happen again." Jamal's mom beamed, her relief palpable. "That's incredible." Jamal, too, felt a surge of hope. "Do you think it'll work?" "It's a step," his dad said. "Change doesn't happen overnight, but this is something we can build on." As the weeks turned into months, life began to settle back into a new rhythm. Jamal threw himself back into basketball, finding joy in the game once again. His confidence returned, slowly but surely, and he started speaking up more in class, sharing his story when it felt right. He realized that his voice carried weight, that his experiences mattered. One day, during a neighborhood cleanup event, Jamal found himself working alongside Mr. Bennett. The older man was quieter than usual, his movements deliberate as he picked up litter along the sidewalk. At first, Jamal kept his distance, unsure of what to say. But as the day went on, he decided to break the silence. "Mr. Bennett," he said, his tone cautious but steady, "I appreciate what you said at the meeting. I know it wasn't easy." Bennett looked up, his face lined with regret. "I should have done better, Jamal. I should have known better." Jamal nodded, his expression thoughtful. "We all make mistakes. What matters is what we do after." The two worked side by side for the rest of the day, their conversation light but meaningful. It wasn't forgiveness, not entirely, but it was a step toward understanding. Jamal realized that holding on to anger wouldn't help him heal. Letting go didn't mean forgetting. It meant making room for something better. As the seasons changed, so did the neighborhood. The community grew closer, more connected. Block parties became more frequent, and people started looking out for one another in ways they hadn't before. The Carters were at the center of it all, their home a gathering place for discussions, celebrations, and everything in between. And then, one day, another letter arrived. This one wasn't anonymous. It came from the police department, a formal invitation for Jamal to speak at their new training program. They wanted him to share his story, to help officers understand the impact of their actions and the importance of treating everyone with respect and fairness. At first, Jamal hesitated. The thought of standing in front of a room full of officers was daunting, the memories of that night still vivid. But after talking it over with his parents, he realized how much good could come from it. This was his chance to make a difference, to turn his pain into something meaningful. When the day came, Jamal stood at the front of the room, his hands trembling slightly as he looked out at the officers. But as he began to speak, the nerves faded. He told them about his life, his family, and what it felt like to be treated as if he didn't belong. He spoke about fear, resilience, and the power of community. By the time he finished, the room was silent, the weight of his words sinking in. Walking out of the station, Jamal felt lighter than he had in months. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but there was still so much work to be done. But for the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful, not just for himself, but for his community, his city, and everyone who had ever felt unseen or unheard. The world wasn't perfect, but it was changing, and Jamal knew he had a part to play in that change, a role he was ready to embrace.